So let's just talk through grammar stage, logic stage, rhetoric stage yet again, because it's so important for us to understand these developmental stages. Grammar, elementary school years, roughly grades 1 through 4. And these, of course, are the years in which the building blocks for learning are laid. The strength of this phase of education is that the mind is so ready to absorb information. I'm sure any of you who grew up in the church, the hymns that you remember are probably the ones you learned when you were 6 or 7 or 8. I mean, I'm 54 and I can tell you those are in there forever. They're not going anywhere. The weakness, of course, is that students have an undeveloped capacity for abstract or critical thought. This will not come as a surprise to you elementary school teachers. But I think it's really important for us to understand why this is the case. And I'm going to give you an example. My beloved guinea pig older son, on whom I tried everything new, he was a very willing student. He really wanted to please me. And I got a great science program that had just been developed. Somebody sent me to review. And I think he was 7 or 8 at the time. He was still pretty little. And it was going to teach him how to think inductively about science. You know, think critically from the earliest age about the practice of science. So there was this page, and it had all of these illustrations of different bug legs. And all the bug legs had different, hairs and features. I can't remember, but they were all different. And what he was supposed to do was figure out what was different about each leg, right? So it's teaching him to observe and to draw conclusions. So I put it down in front of him and I said, okay, find out what's different about these legs. And he worked really hard. He looked. And he looked up and he said, I think I've got it. This one on the top of the page is closer to the margin than all the others. And this one down here is in darker print. Okay. Yeah, so the inductive thinking was a failure at that point. The problem was that he didn't have enough information to draw on to know what questions to ask, right? So when we teach the youngest children by giving them lots and lots and lots of information, we are not drilling and killing, my least favorite phrase. What we are doing is we're supplying them with the basic information that they need in order to be able to think critically. In most cases, you can't teach a second grader to think critically, because thinking critically means you're able to take information and recognize patterns in it. And they haven't seen patterns enough to recognize them. They don't have enough information to be able to draw deductions from them. So a much better way to teach that would have just been to say, look, here are all these bug legs. This one has this kind of feature. This one has this kind of feature. This one has this kind of feature. Why don't we memorize that together? One of the analogies that I like to use is, if you only knew English and no other language, and somebody gave you a sheet of German words and said, identify which ones of these are nouns and which ones are verbs, you wouldn't be able to do it, because you don't have enough information to be able to start to recognize the patterns. But if you've never learned German, but you've studied, you've studied French, and maybe you've studied Korean or a non-Western language, you have started to accumulate some idea of how the patterns of language work. You can take that information, apply it to a field of which you know nothing, and come up with the correct answer. So our task with these elementary students is to give them the raw material to start recognizing patterns. I don't know, how many of you are parents of younger children? Yeah, a lot of you. Okay, so you know how their minds work. When they're first grade, second grade, they'll get up and they'll say, is it Christmas yet? And you say, no, we just had Christmas last month. And then they'll get up again and they'll say, is it my birthday? No, we just had your birthday 6 weeks ago. Only comes once a year. Is it going to snow? No, it's not going to snow. It's August. They ask these questions because they haven't lived through a repetition of years often enough to recognize the patterns. It takes repetition. It takes time for them to recognize that some things happen once and never happen again. Some things happen and then they happen again on a predictable schedule. Some things happen all of the time. Education is helping give them that repetition so that they can recognize the patterns. I'll just give you one more example and then we'll move on. I love grammar, and I've done this with all my children, even though I know better. I say state of being. State of being verbs. State of being verbs mean that I am. And they'd look at me. I had boys, so they'd say, hungry? Well, yes, I know you're hungry. You're always hungry. But I am. They'd look at me. Mom? Yes, I am mom, but that's not what I'm talking about. State of being verb. The problem was that they didn't have enough basic information to take concrete occurrences of people just being and to extrapolate from that this abstraction of being. So instead of trying to explain the abstraction to them, what you should do is not what I did. It's say, am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. That's state of being. Memorize that. Chant it back to me 15 times. What is state of being? State of being, the abstraction, is that state represented by these concrete words. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. So I see a lot, I tend to sort of camp out on this point a little bit because when I speak to classical schools, I find that one of the common pitfalls is an effort to push elementary students into doing work that they are just not yet ready for. And I spend a lot of time talking to elementary school teachers who know that their students need more repetition, more drill, move a little bit slower, take the time to really get those basics in there so that they can start to think critically. And often, by either parents or administrators, those teachers are being pushed to cover too much too fast. With elementary school children, the only thing that moves them towards critical thinking is for the Earth to go around the sun one more time, right? And we have to take that very, very seriously. So we're going to talk some more about different subject areas, but here are some ways in which, in our next session, but here are some ways in which this affects how we teach. Obviously, in terms of reading, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the next session, you're going to lay a good foundation of phonics and establish the habit of reading. That's just very basic. In spelling and in grammar, you're going to spend a lot of time studying rules, basic usage, and mechanics. What you're not necessarily going to see, because this is completely developmentally normal, is them taking those rules and those mechanics and then applying them in other areas. They're going to pass their spelling test and spell all those words wrong in their composition. Because they're still in that concrete way of thinking. They're still accumulating information. For an elementary student to take what they learned in spelling or in grammar and then to apply it to actual writing is like, it's like writing is an island over here and spelling is an island over here. And between there is a vast, vast area that no man can bridge. Okay? You have to continue to drill the basics in order to build that bridge across to the next field of study. Being able to connect things that you learned in two different areas of study is a critical thinking skill. It takes the power to think in abstractions. It takes more maturity than a lot of elementary students have. In writing, until students can write fluently, it's my opinion, and this is someone, I am a professional writer and I've taught writing for many, many, many years, that most elementary students should not be doing original compositions. They should be writing summaries of the information that they have learned elsewhere. Because writing is this very complex project of coming up with something to say, putting it into words, writing it down on paper. Each one of those steps is difficult and complicated. And one of our principles of teaching in neoclassicism should be that we never ask students to do more than one new and complicated thing at the same time. So if we're making them come up with sentences and put those sentences down on paper, we should give them the thing to write about up front, not make them come up with an original idea. And we'll talk some more about that in our next session. In mathematics, you're doing arithmetic. You are doing the basic operations. You are not yet with elementary students doing mathematics. In history, the focus should be on stories and biographies because that is what is concrete. Places, people, events, not why. Literature. This is, again, when we're studying literature with elementary students, one of my least favorite teaching techniques is to ask them to predict. How can you predict when you don't have enough storylines and enough characters, enough of a memory bank to even know how stories work? Give them the stories and then ask them what happened in that story. The ability to predict comes as they gain a library in their brains of stories and of characters. And then in science, the truth is, you can't really do science as we think of it with elementary students. Return to my bug story, and that's an illustration of why. Asking them again to predict, which is a center of the scientific method, is asking them to operate in a complete unknown. You know, even something as simple for younger children as putting together, you know, vinegar and baking soda and saying, what do you think will happen? They don't know. You know, it could turn green, it could explode, a baby could appear, because that keeps happening, and that's kind of mysterious too. I've actually, well, I won't get sidetracked. So what you are doing with them when they're in elementary school is really nature study. It's the exploration of the world. It is giving them the information that they're going to need in order to think critically. Now, there is in all of this a really deep, a deeply important observation to make about children and what they need for security. Elementary school kids need repetition because they don't have those patterns in mind. That's why they weep when you leave the house and go on a date, because they think you're never coming back again. Because they haven't seen you leave the house and come back enough times to think, oh, there, I recognize that pattern, right? Elementary school students need stability, they need repetition, because this is what teaches them how the world works. It is why they need routines. They need to repeat the same things again and again. They are learning how the world functions. And until they see repetition over and over again, they don't know how the world functions. Everything is scary and unpredictable. They need routine both in life and in education.